Barbara Arrowsmith Young, and welcome to the program.
It's my pleasure to be here.
What a wonderful book, the woman who changed her brain. Your story is so inspiring, and I'm just completely in awe of you. Tell us about what your learning difficulties were when you were born.
Absolutely. So I really realized that I had some problems before I started school. I was incredibly clumsy, uncoordinated, really accident-prone. I mean, I didn't understand exactly what the problem was, but certainly had lots and lots of injuries, and my mother thought I wasn't going to survive past age 5. I mean, later I learned that the part of my brain that registers sort of the location of the left side of my body in space wasn't working very well. But then certainly when I got into school, in year 1, that's when everything kind of came crashing down. I was identified as having a mental block by my grade 1 teacher because there wasn't even the term learning difficulty or learning disability. It wasn't in existence at that point. So I thought I actually had a piece of wood in my head when the teacher said I had a mental block. And obviously I didn't, but I had blockages. I mean, I struggled to learn how to read. I struggled to learn how to write. I read things backwards, upside down, sideways, wrote, backwards. If somebody gave me two-digit numbers, I just add the numbers up randomly. So, and I could see other students in school learning. I mean, they seemed to be getting it, and I couldn't. And I got the strap in grade 1 because I think, my teacher was just beside herself. She didn't really know how to cope with me because I appeared somewhat intelligent, but then just couldn't learn. And at that point, there was not a belief that your brain could change. The belief was your brain's fixed. The brain you're born with is the brain you die with. So I felt like I was given a life sentence in grade 1. My teacher said I would never learn like other children, accept my limitations, that all of my education was going to be challenging and a struggle. So that was the beginning. I mean, some children go to school and they're excited and really want to learn. I mean, I was anxious every morning that I walked out the door to go to school because it just wasn't a happy experience. It was a struggle. And my mother was an educator, so she developed flashcards, which I joke I became a workaholic in grade 1 because I had to have these flashcards at lunchtime and after school. But I wasn't happy at the time, but I'm very lucky that she did what she did because I eventually learned how to read and to write and do basic numeracy, but it didn't address the underlying learning difficulty. I couldn't understand my world. I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't tell time. I couldn't understand relationships, like a fraction. I could understand 1 because I could see something concrete. I could understand 2 because I could see 2 items, but you put the 1 over the 2, which is a relationship. I couldn't understand it, double negatives, even something as simple as my aunt also being my mother's sister. Like, how could somebody have 2 relationships? I was very concrete. So I relied on memory to get through school because I have a photographic visual memory and a verbatim auditory memory, but always afraid that somebody would see through kind of this fiction that I felt I had built, or I felt like I was an imposter because I knew how much I was struggling and not understanding my world.
And with the physical side of it as well, why were you having sort of accidents? Why were you so accident prone?
Well, there's what I learned later. There's part of one's brain that controls sensory awareness on one or the other side of your body. So for me, it was in the right hemisphere because it controls the left side of your body. And it's that sensory feedback that tells your muscles how far they're moving in space or where your body's in space. If I was walking through a doorway, I wouldn't judge how close my body was to the door frame, and I would just as likely bounce off the door frame as go through the middle of the door. Things as simple as, most people, if they put their hand on a hot burner, their brain tells them very quickly, it's your hand that's on fire, pull it off. And my brain would tell me there's pain, but it wouldn't register where the pain was coming from. So I learned as a young child that I had to watch the left side of my body, or I would become significantly injured. And interestingly, once I learned how to drive a car later on, given that I didn't know where the left side of my body was, I also didn't know where the left side of that car was. So my car was dented and banged up, just like I was, and I was terribly uncoordinated in sports. So, I mean, I struggled academically because of the reasoning, the comprehension difficulty, but I struggled athletically. So, some children, if they're struggling with learning, there might be one area that they actually excel at. I didn't excel at either of those areas.
It amazes me that you were able to, and that's just a real testament to your strength, even though I know that you struggled emotionally and with your self-esteem, but to still get through school at all is just amazing.
Well, I mean, there were some strengths. I mean, and I guess, I don't know if it's a testament to our school system as I was going through. You get a fair ways through with memory.
Yeah.
But there were some times when I would get 90% on an exam, because what I would do is I would just memorize all of my notebooks and my textbooks, and seriously, I would just, flip through in my brain all the pages, and when I was reading the question, I would flip through the pages, think, I think this is the answer, but I was never certain. So if I would left an exam, I had no idea. If friends said, "How did you do?" I truly had no idea how I did it. Sometimes I did 90%, and sometimes I got 10%, and I worked just as hard for that 10%, as for the 90. It's just I didn't make as good a match, in terms of what the question was asking and what I put down on paper. And my teachers concluded, if I could get 90% once, they concluded I didn't work for that 10%, that I, was being lazy or not applying myself, and I was absolutely applying myself with the best will in the world. I just couldn't comprehend. So it was a really, I lived in this kind of sense of uncertainty, this fog, where I just did not understand what was going on around me, and I lived in fear most of the time, because I would be afraid that somebody would ask me something and I wouldn't understand, and then I would look stupid. And in grade 1, I started to view myself as bad and as stupid.
Yes, and of course, if people treat you like that all the time, as you were at school, then of course, as children, we learn that's true.
Oh, absolutely. We internalize it.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that really broke my heart when I wrote my book, in the first edition in 2012, I did a lot of interviews with students, with parents, but what I kept hearing from all these students was still the stigma associated with having a learning difficulty. They felt they were a burden on their parents. They didn't want to really talk about it. They spent so much energy trying to fit in, just like I did when I started school in the late 50s, early 60s. And I had thought naively that maybe things had changed. I mean, I think we have more awareness of learning difficulties now than in my day. But it just is so tragic that these students, these individuals, still feel such shame, such stigma. And that's why, the vision that I ended my book with in 2012 was, let's put cognitive programs in grade 1 or year 1. Let's just make it a normal part of curriculum, because we go to school to learn. We learn with our brain. So if we're working our brain to enhance it and improve it, we're going to be more effective learners, and every child can benefit. And then what that will do is the children that by, say, grade 3 or 4 now, traditionally would get identified as having learning difficulties will never get identified, because by grade 3 or 4 it'll be addressed. I work with a lot of adults that just have unevenness in their cognitive profile. Those individuals, if they have access to cognitive programming, in the early years, would get that addressed. And I believe even gifted students can benefit from good cognitive stimulation. And that would remove the stigma. It would just be normal. We all go to school to work our brains and to learn. And it's happening. There are 3 schools now that are actually doing this.
Yes, and the thing is that the way that I viewed it as well, and while I was reading your book, is that people like yourselves are a true benefit to society and our world in expanding it, because you and others like you have taught us how much we can actually do with our brain. And so I don't understand, to be honest, why people view children with learning disabilities as a negative. I see it as a positive, because having those disabilities has taught all of us that there is so much more, and what you have learnt about the brain is just, I mean, it's so powerful.
It truly is powerful. I mean, I think this whole, the knowledge we have now about neuroplasticity, which just means our brain is capable of change through experience, through stimulation. It's so hopeful because it holds promise. If we can understand the principles of neuroplasticity, and if we can utilize those principles to address a whole range of problems. I mean, there are people looking at neuroplasticity and pain, neuroplasticity and mental health issues, anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, neuroplasticity and the aging brain, and in my work, neuroplasticity and people with learning difficulties. I mean, it holds so much hope and promise. And I think one of the challenges has been that this research is coming out of neuroscience, which is very a different discipline than education. I mean, the teachers that I meet around the world, they got into education because they wanted to make a real difference in the lives of their students. And we aren't giving them the tools and the knowledge that are necessary to do that for these individuals with learning difficulties. So I think, the people in the neuroscience field need to do a better job of how do we bridge that gap between neuroscience and education? How do we bring the knowledge that we're beginning to learn into educational practice? And I'm really excited at the University of British Columbia in Canada. They've just started a collaborative, which they've named after me. So it's the Arrowsmith Young Collaborative for Neuroscience and Education. And one of the big missions that they have is translating neuroscience research into educational practice. And I think this is going to change the face of education. You give teachers the tools, and they're going to run with them.
One of the, and you bring this up quite early in the book, is the term hardwiring. That is such a misconception, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Like, we're really shaping our brains all the time. I mean, we talk about how our brains shape us, which they do. I mean, because they filter our perceptions, of ourselves, of our world, our relationship to the world, or our relationship to other people. But we can actually shape our brains, and we are shaping them all the time by what we engage in, how we sustain our attention and focus. And then if we can even sort of supercharge that to, take those principles and put them into educational practice, which is, what I've spent the last 37 years of my life doing, first for myself, and then once I saw the results, I thought, I need to take this work out into the world to help others that are also struggling with learning, and that's truly, my mission at this point. I mean, there's part of me that would like to, stay home and go out in my garden, but I feel like I have a sacred trust, like all of these children, and it's not just children. I work, as I said, with young adults that are struggling. I feel like they've entrusted me to be their voice, to go out and say, we're struggling and we need a solution to these struggles, and my work is one of those solutions.
Can you give us an example of an exercise that you did initially to start training yourself?
Sure. The very first one I created was, I think I talk about in the books, was clocks. And it wasn't, I was 25, 26, somewhere in that vicinity, and couldn't tell time. I still could not read a clock. Because the part of my brain that processes relationships didn't understand the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand. And it's very classic with this difficulty. If someone is really slow at learning to tell time, it's quite likely that this part of the brain is underperforming. For me, it was very severe because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't learn how to read a clock. So it wasn't that I wanted to get better at telling time, but I wanted to find an activity that would make my brain process relationships. And that's what I came up with, based on reading Lurie's work, because he talked about people with that difficulty can't tell time. So, I created clocks, drawing clocks, reading clocks, and eventually got really accurate, after hundreds of hours, at, telling time, interpreting it. I got fast, I got accurate, but so now I could read a clock, but I didn't feel cognitive change. So I kept adding more complexity, which we now know that is what drives neuroplastic change. If you make something too easy, your brain is not going to engage. If you make something too difficult, your brain is not going to engage. So you have to find that kind of perfect level of strain, but not too much strain. So I kept adding more and more hands with the idea that it was making my brain process more and more relationships, which is what it couldn't do. And for me, I got to a certain level of complexity in that exercise where I was processing 4 relationships simultaneously. And what we found now in the research that we've done is that's about average level of functioning. So it was when I hit that point that I got my breakthrough, where I could listen to people speaking and understand as they spoke, whereas before I lived in what I called lag time. I would memorize what people were saying, I'd walk away, and for the next 2 hours I'd play over what they said like a little tape recorder. But the problem was, if 2 hours later I finally understood what they said, they hadn't hung around to have a conversation with me. Now I could listen to somebody, just like in this conversation we're having, understand what the other person was saying, actually make a comment or respond to what they were saying, and I was part of human discourse for the first time. I mean, it was so profound to feel like I could actually engage in relating to people through language, which I'd never been able to do. Then I could open a book and read a page and understand it as I was reading it. Before, I would read pages 5, 10, 15 times, because again, what Lurie had talked about, when somebody has a difficulty, and he was the Russian neuropsychologist that I studied in his books, he said that somebody with this difficulty can never verify meaning. So they're walking around constantly hypothesizing, constantly in a state of uncertainty, which was my experience. Now, I could read the page, understand it, read the next page, understand that, and I could start to build on my understanding. Whereas before, I was never certain that I understood what the author was driving at or meaning. It was so profound. I could listen to documentaries on TV and understand them. I could look at mathematics and understand it, and I went back and taught myself elementary, high school, and college level mathematics, and now understood the logic behind it, because before there was no cause and effect, there was no logic, there were no whys in my world. There was no humor in my world because I couldn't understand irony and jokes. Now I could get jokes and actually developed a sense of humor. Before I was vulnerable to con artists because I couldn't see logical logics. I couldn't see logical inconsistencies. It had a profound impact.
Just amazing, isn't it? And I think what is wonderful about your story is that you have had these learning disabilities, and yet you're the one that's created these exercises for yourself.
Mm-hmm. It's rather unusual.
Yes.
I mean, Norman Deutsch, who wrote the foreword to my book, and he wrote The Brain That Changes Itself, points that out, right? He says that it's rare. It's rarely is the person who makes a discovery the one with a defect. Barbara is the exception. And I think I was very blessed and very lucky. I mean, it was my unique cognitive profile. I had some areas that were probably at the level of stroke. They were so severe. Yes. And then I had some areas that were at a gifted level. And those ones that, had really good, executive functioning. So that was the part that kept driving and driving. I didn't understand my world, but I kept driving to try to understand it. Whereas, a lot of students that we work with, understandably, have given up because I think, my exceptional strengths and my exceptional weaknesses, and then the parents that I had, my mother, being an educator and had won awards for her contribution to education in the province of Ontario, where I live in Canada, and my father being, a scientist, an inventor, very, very creative, and instilling this belief in me that, if there's a problem with no solution, you go out and find a solution, and don't be limited by conventional wisdom. If the world says you can't do it, don't let that stop you, because that's how science goes forward. So I had that in my background. I had no idea if I'd be successful, but I was desperate. I mean, I saw no future for myself and figured, I have no idea if this is going to work, but I have to try it, because I don't see that I'm still going to be here, on the face of the earth if I don't.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, this is an incredible breakthrough, I think, for the education system. And I know that some of this stuff has actually been around for some time, because I know that the turning point in your life came in the 70s when you found out about the Russian man that had similar experience to you, but for different reasons, because he was shot in the head. But the fact that there are people in the education system that are starting to embrace this kind of learning is just wonderful, because as I was listening to you, and I know you do mention this in the book, but as I was listening to you and the exercises that you were doing for your brain, that's exactly how someone would tackle using weights in the gym. They don't do it too easy, but they can't do it too hard either.
It's a very similar principle. They call it effortful processing, which means you just have to find the right level to process that has some effort, but not too much or too little. So
yes.
It's the same concept.
Yes, and finally, can I just ask you, how do you keep your brain fit and healthy today?
I meditate, which certainly, anything that reduces stress is really important. Like all the research is fundamentally pointing to the importance of reducing stress, because stress actually leads to negative neuroplasticity. I mean, neuroplasticity can go in positive or negative directions. So whether it's, gardening, I am a passionate gardener, but meditation, going for a nice walk, practicing gratitude, good sleep is really, really important. The research is pointing to that. Proper nutrition. So those are kind of things that anybody can do. And then every once in a while I go back in and just, do one of my exercises. I had an injury a couple of years ago where I developed a really horrendous pain condition. So I actually pulled out one of the exercises I created for myself in 1979 that dealt with sensation, and that helped. So those are the kind of things, and keep engaged in the world.
Yes.
I'm going out and meeting people. I'm passionate about this work. I mean, my mission is to get this program into more and more schools, and I get stimulated by all the amazing people that I meet in Australia. And the program's in 23 schools in Australia. In 2012, it was in 0 schools. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, that is very, very exciting, and I so appreciate chatting with you today, Barbara, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.